The Pentagon announced new plans to screen servicemen and women for low testosterone.
The US and Iran have exchanged further strikes around the Strait of Hormuz and across the Gulf.
We have seen many injured protesters here.
El Niño is not just knocking on the door, it risks blowing the house down.
Raindrops to kill them bastards.
Trump has accused China of carrying out the largest compromise of election data in history.
Spain have won the Men's Football World Cup for the second time.
Reform UK leader Nigel Farage, the resurgent right-wing leader, facing a man wearing a bin and a cape.
I was baptized before the gods, but I'm still holding flaws. I'm still holding yours.
Tasmania's most famous visitor, Neil the Seal, has returned to sea after spending weeks at Tasmania's 7 Mile Beach.
In the east of England, within the county of Essex, lies the coastal town of Clacton, which is currently the battleground of the most interesting election on Earth. The upcoming vote for Clacton's Member of Parliament is currently between two primary candidates. In one corner, we have Nigel Farage, millionaire leader of the Reform UK party, key figure in the nation's Brexit movement, and currently the most likely person to become the next British Prime Minister. In the other corner is Count Binface, a self-described intergalactic space warrior from the planet Sigma-9. The race is closer than you might think. The Clacton election, scheduled for the 13th of August, was triggered by the resignation of Nigel Farage this month, who's held the seat since July 2024. The resignation followed reports of Farage's financial interests being investigated, specifically undeclared gifts he received in the lead-up to becoming a Member of Parliament. One such gift was a payment of £5 million from Thailand-based crypto billionaire Christopher Harborn. Farage stated that the money was a reward for campaigning for Brexit for 27 years. Also under investigation was undeclared funding from George Cottrell, a 32-year-old aristocrat and financier. To call Cottrell well-connected would be a pretty big understatement. As his uncle is a baron, his father went to school with Prince Andrew, and his mother is the former girlfriend of King Charles. Cottrell was arrested in 2016 for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, blackmail, and extortion, and ultimately served 8 months in prison. Reform UK has stated that the aforementioned gifts to Farage are from his personal friends, and are therefore not required to be reported. Mr. Farage's decision to resign only to immediately run again is an effort to solidify his position despite the controversy. In his own words, quote, "I will resign as a Member of Parliament for Clacton-on-Sea, thereby forcing a by-election. I've decided that the people of Clacton should be the judges of my actions. This will be a people versus the establishment by-election." Upon accepting his resignation, Chancellor Michael Reeves would comment, quote, "If he wants to spend the summer arguing with a bin, I won't stop him." Notably, none of the major political parties decided to field a candidate to challenge the seat of Clacton, with Restore Britain leader Rupert Lowe stating that they didn't want to be involved in, quote, "a reform-sponsored media circus." The Farage versus Binface election would become quite a spectacle at the House of Commons, which is why we took the liberty of compiling some of the best moments.
But one politician intends to spend the summer avoiding scrutiny, refusing to set out his plans. So does he not agree that what the country deserves is a televised debate between Nigel Farage and Count Binface?
Prime Minister.
With the costly fiasco of the Conservatives' Rwanda scheme long behind us and our relationship with our nearest neighbours and friends in France rebuilt, does the Prime Minister think that now is the time to establish a safe and legal route between planet Sigma-9 and Clacton?
And I have to tell her I cannot back joke figures with ridiculous policies, which is why I'm supporting Count Binface.
I think the Prime Minister did endorse the bin man, but could he clarify that? If he won't put up a Labour candidate in Clacton, who does he actually want to win?
Mr. Speaker, I know that Reform believe in recycling politicians.
As for the policies of each candidate, we obviously don't have time to go into all of them, but we'll do our best to hit the most noteworthy points. Starting with Reform UK, the party wants to raise the minimum tax threshold from £12,500 to £20,000, increase the number of police officers by 40,000, and introduce a patriotic curriculum in schools. Reform also wants to cut corporate tax from 25 to 20%, reduce illegal immigration, and scrap the UK's net zero target, which it calls the greatest act of negligence. It also plans to abolish the nation's infamous TV licenses, leave the European Convention on Human Rights, and institute its own Department of Government Efficiency. We now move on to Count Binface, who also has a long list of ambitious policies. These include a vow to have corners properly refereed in football, Wi-Fi on trains that actually work, and for cyclists who break the highway code to be forced to ride unicycles instead. He also promises to abolish auto-renewals on all online subscriptions, send himself to Eurovision, and build one affordable house. As for who's more likely to win, the answer may depend on who you ask. A July poll by Ipsos found that 33% of British adults would prefer Count Binface to win over Farage. Meanwhile, 32% preferred neither to win, while 21% preferred Farage to be re-elected. With this said, Clacton isn't necessarily representative of the rest of Britain. The region is 96% white, voted 75% in favour of Brexit, has one of the oldest electorates in the country, and is comparatively deprived in terms of employment, education, and income. This has historically made it a target seat for right-wing populists like Farage, who won by a landslide in the 2024 election. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget that Farage specifically called this the, quote, people versus the establishment by-election. By this metric, if the people of Clacton are truly interested in voting for an outsider, Reform UK might not be fielding the best candidate. After all, Nigel Farage is an ex-commodities broker who got a £5 million donation from his billionaire friend, while Count Binface is a 6,000-year-old intergalactic space alien. We also need to remember that the British public have had a history of voting for crazy shit just for the hell of it. In 2016, they voted to name a £200 million polar research ship Boaty McBoatface. That same year, the British public went on to vote for Brexit, which, although was pretty funny, has since crippled wage growth, drastically reduced economic activity, and is recognised as a key contributor to the cost of living crisis. It's important to point out that even if Farage wins the August by-election, his financial donations will still be investigated by the Parliamentary Standards Watchdog. From here, one of three things will happen. The first is that Farage will be found to be innocent, in which case he's off the hook. The second possibility is that the conduct breach is considered minor, meaning Farage will be given the opportunity to apologise and be asked to mitigate future incidents. And the third scenario is if the investigation finds a serious breach of conduct. In this case, if Farage is suspended for longer than 10 days, Clacton's constituents can call for another by-election if 10% of eligible registered voters sign a recall petition. This would mean Farage would be up for election 3 separate times for a single 5-year term. The results of the by-election will be known within a matter of weeks, and we'd like to wish the good people of Clacton all the best in exercising their democratic rights. This is usually the part where we do our Surfshark sponsor, just the same as we have for the last 6 years. But this time, we're doing something different. You see, when Swag walked into the Surfshark offices this month, they said, "Swaggy baby, you're killing it with the news. We all have the news here at Surfshark. But we also have this little service called Incogni, and we think you'd be the perfect fit. So tell me, have you ever had your personal information stolen?" Swag? Hey, are you still with us, kid? Swaggy. God damn it. He's probably thinking of Titanfall or something. That's right, everyone. Today's video is sponsored by Incogni. In case you didn't know, Incogni is an online service that removes your personal information from the internet. And it's an absolute must-have if you're a fan of privacy. Unfortunately, we now live in a world where half of the apps on your phone know what you've had for breakfast this morning. And all those companies are just another way that data brokers can get their hands on your personal information. According to a report by the Identity Theft Resource Center, data breaches worldwide rose 211% from 2023 to 24. These breaches expose information such as a person's financial history, their email address, their political and religious beliefs, and even where they live. That information can be used in all kinds of ways, such as criminals taking out loans under your name, or health insurance companies raising your rates depending on your online activity. We're still not sure which one sounds worse. Fortunately, Incogni will painstakingly contact hundreds of data brokers on your behalf and formally request your data be removed. All you've got to do is give them a few details like your name and email address, and they'll do the heavy lifting. Incogni also has a custom removal feature, which means if you find a site that has your information, you can specifically tell them to get it removed. If you like the idea of having a clean slate online, you can get a 60% discount by using the code SIRSWAG at checkout. Or just go to incogni.com/SIRSWAG and we'll apply it for you. If you're not 100% satisfied, you can also back out in the first 30 days and get a full refund. Not too shabby. Incogni. Let the Russian hacker go hungry. Meanwhile, a Washington pastor says not giving him money is as bad as being gay. The US Department of Transportation wants to end DEI bike lanes, and the Australian Prime Minister says that he'd bang Kylie Minogue. As the US government is quite often taking up a huge portion of our runtime, we figured we'd do our best to condense this coverage into a fun little lightning round. First up was the announcement by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that the US military will now test for testosterone levels. Such tests will be optional for troops under the age of 30. However, for those 30 and older, testosterone screening will be mandatory as a part of their annual medical review. As for what these screenings would address, Mr. Hegseth stated that it was to keep troops, quote, strong, resilient, and capable, and that the modern battlefield demanded maximum psychological and mental readiness. Testosterone levels in men naturally decline with age, and have long been linked to issues such as weight gain and mood swings. However, experts have debated whether these problems can be diagnosed and whether hormone replacement is an appropriate treatment. The move comes after the Food and Drug Administration proposed the easing of prescription limits on testosterone gels, pills, patches, and injections. Although some influencers have promoted the use of testosterone as a way to look younger, build muscle, and stay mentally sharp, such uses are not accepted by most medical experts. In 2025, the FDA removed a warning about the risk of heart attack and stroke on testosterone drugs. As expected, the Republican administration was criticized by their Democratic counterparts for the move, with Senator and former Iraq War veteran Tammy Duckworth stating that it sounded, quote, like gender-affirming care. The testosterone screening announcement follows April's controversial decision to stop the US military's mandatory flu shots. When repealing the 80-year mandate, Mr. Hegseth cited medical autonomy and religious freedom for the decision. This was met by immediate backlash by all branches of the military, a flu outbreak that sickened 275 people and 4 hospitalizations. A partial reversal of the decision was made 2 months later, allowing branches to ask for exceptions. Next up is President Trump's 25-minute speech in the middle of the month, in which he claimed that US election systems were compromised, and that the Chinese government ran an operation to influence American voters. The speech follows the president's long-running claim that the 2020 election was rigged, and to this day, Trump has yet to accept the result. Since the 2020 election, dozens of audits, investigations, and court rulings have found no evidence of fraud or significant issues. As for Chinese interference, President Trump said he had discovered a Chinese-run influence campaign, which was intended to stop him winning the 2020 presidency. Trump would go on to claim that China had paid journalists to write negative stories, and that the country had stolen 220 million US voter files. The president's speech contradicts a joint report by US intelligence agencies released in 2021, which stated that China did not deploy influence efforts during the 2020 election. US intelligence believes that although China considered such an action, it decided against it, as it didn't believe either candidate would be advantageous enough to risk pissing off the United States. Of course, that isn't to say other nations weren't interested in influencing the 2020 election. The same intelligence report stated with high confidence that Russia worked to re-elect President Trump, believing Biden would be a disadvantage to its national interests. Judging by Biden's Ukraine policy, this was a well-founded fear. Meanwhile, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and Hezbollah attempted smaller-scale influence efforts to undermine President Trump's 2020 election campaign. Considering in this term alone, Trump has helped assassinate, kidnap, or press murder charges on the leaders of all 4, it seems as if US intelligence was on the money. It should be noted that although influence operations were undertaken by the the aforementioned parties, there was no significant evidence that election infrastructure was targeted during 2020. At the time, President Trump's director of the Cybersecurity and Intelligence Security Agency said it was, quote, the most secure in American history. He would be subsequently fired by Trump 5 days later. This month's announcement did, however, come with the release of declassified documents. Although, much like the partially released Epstein files, a lot of it was entirely redacted. None of the files showed evidence of Chinese election interference, and there was no evidence that China or any other country manipulated the vote in 2020, or any other year. As for the 220 million documents, that's all just available to anyone who can pay for it. Political campaigns buy them to know which doors to knock on and where to deliver mail. With all things considered, this story is probably a better ad for Incogni than the one we put together earlier. The speech comes after President Trump's continued push to pass the SAVE Act, which would require people to provide ID and proof of citizenship in order to vote. On the surface, this is a very reasonable piece of legislation, as polling suggests it's supported by 71% of Democratic voters and 95% of Republicans. However, opponents to the bill argue that all the kinks haven't been worked out quite yet. An estimated 21 million Americans don't have documents proving their citizenship readily available, while 2.6 million lack any form of government-issued ID. The SAVE Act would require citizens registering to vote or changing their registration to appear in person at an election office. As the necessary documentation also requires a person to prove their identity and citizenship status, this would mean driver's licenses would not be an adequate proof of ID. For most, this would mean presenting a passport or birth certificate. However, considering half of all US citizens don't own a passport and an estimated 0% know the current location of their birth certificate, this will likely disqualify a huge chunk of US citizens. A person's current name would also have to match their birth name, which creates a particular barrier for the roughly 69 million married women who took their partner's last name. It should also be noted that cases of non-citizens voting are already extremely rare. Voting already requires a driver's license number or a social security number to be verified through a database maintained in part by the Department of Homeland Security. Another claim by President Trump was that approximately 278,000 non-citizens registered to vote in federal elections. Not only were these figures not verified, but there wasn't a single allegation that any of these people actually voted. The SAVE database has repeatedly been criticized for being riddled with errors, and a federal judge recently barred it from being used, over fears that citizens would be wrongly purged from voter rolls. As for President Trump's claims that election infrastructure is vulnerable to manipulation, this was also somewhat overstated. Election officials have admitted that voting machines do have a risk of manipulation. This is why safeguards like physical security, equipment testing, paper ballot backups, and post-election audits are used to mitigate these shortcomings. It's also worth mentioning that despite President Trump's reservations, his recent policies seem to run counter to these concerns. Such actions include ousting members of an election commission in charge of overseeing the testing of voting systems, cutting millions in funding to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which helped keep the state and local elections secure, and disbanding an FBI task force focused on investigating foreign influence campaigns. Supporters of the bill maintain that tightened checks around identity ensures that elections can be as safe and secure as possible. Detractors of the bill argue that it's an entirely unnecessary piece of legislation designed to disenfranchise voters ahead of November's midterm elections. President Trump quite famously made similar claims around election integrity leading up to the 2020 election, which would spectacularly culminate in the January 6th incident. Current polling indicates President Trump has a 36% approval rating, which isn't a good sign for his midterm prospects, as sitting presidents usually perform poorly by default. Experts currently predict President Trump will almost certainly lose control of the House of Representatives, while Senate control is still anyone's game. If a lot of our US coverage sounds like something you've heard before, then we're afraid that isn't about to change. This month, it was reported that $80 billion of President Trump's tariffs have so far been refunded, following a Supreme Court decision that found them unlawful earlier this year. The president's tariff wave was imposed in April 2025, placing a minimum 10% tariff on nearly every country around the world, For those who may have forgotten, a tariff is simply a tax imposed on goods entering a country. The tax itself is paid by the importer, in most cases American businesses. Tariffs are generally a measure to protect certain domestic industries by making foreign goods more expensive, and therefore less competitive. However, in February this year, the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump overstepped his authority by implementing such wide, sweeping tariffs, which is why refunds are being issued. It should be noted that although businesses were expected to pay these tariffs, the costs were often passed on to the consumer. An estimate by the Tax Foundation found that these tariffs cost the average American household $1,000 in 2025, and are expected to cost $700 over 2026. As the so far $80 billion in tariff refunds were given to the companies who paid them, critics have argued that the US government essentially just took money from American households and gave it to businesses. With this in mind, the Trump administration maintains that tariffs are a path to reducing America's federal budget. Its latest push comes in the form of an anti-forced labor tariff, which was imposed on 60 countries in June. Forced labor is considered a form of modern slavery, with US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer stating at the time, quote, "The failure of our most important trading partners to address the importation of goods made with forced labor is unacceptable. This creates a dynamic where American workers are forced to compete globally on an unlevel playing field. An estimated 50 million people around the world are currently considered to be trapped in modern slavery," meaning the US government's concerns certainly aren't unfounded. However, according to the Walk-Free Global Slavery Index, the United States has a higher prevalence of slavery than 15 countries impacted by the tariffs. Many nations have subsequently accused the United States of using slavery as an excuse to once again impose wide-sweeping tariffs. Over his second term, President Trump has gained something of a reputation for threatening tariffs on countries for various slights and infractions. This has included a 200% tariff on French wine after France declined to join President Trump's Board of Peace, a 10% tariff for countries opposed to US control of Greenland, a 100% tariff on foreign films, and recently this month, a tariff on Canada for wildfire smoke within US borders. We're not sure what the next round of tariffs will look like, or how they'll ultimately be justified, but we can only hope they're as fun and interesting as all those that have come before. Lightning round over. The European continent witnessed scorching temperatures over July, marking the region's third severe heatwave since May. Temperatures in Europe reached the highest ever recorded for May, with Western Europe experiencing the hottest June the following month. France, meanwhile, saw its hottest recorded temperature since measurements began in 1947. The severe heat is estimated to have caused thousands of excess deaths, with the Euro-MOMO Mortality Monitoring Hub estimating 14,260 people died between the 21st and the 28th of June. A large contributor to this death toll is that many European nations simply aren't equipped to deal with heat at this magnitude. Unlike America, Australia, or other nations in Asia, air conditioning isn't a widely adopted technology in Europe, as temperatures tend to sit a lot lower. In France, for example, only 25% of homes are equipped with air conditioning, and the subject has been somewhat taboo in French politics. Many within the country argue that adopting air conditioning is an acceptance of climate change, and that making extreme heat more tolerable is a band-aid solution to a bigger problem. For others, air conditioning is seen as a decadent luxury, the likes of which many within French society can't afford. Some observers have attributed Europe's recent heat waves to El Niño, a natural weather phenomenon in which unusually warm ocean water in the Pacific Ocean changes weather patterns around the world. With this said, El Niño's link to recent weather patterns in Europe has been relatively weak. As climate scientist Friedrich Otto from London's Imperial College would explain, quote, "Yes, it's climate change. Yes, it's us. And no, it's not El Niño. Simply put, we remain on a one-way trip towards a more dangerous future, and it's time we hit the brakes." Meanwhile, scientists from the World Weather Attribution say that El Niño didn't contribute to the severe heat, and that the heat wave was virtually impossible without climate change. The European continent leads the world by a wide margin when it comes to climate action, with all EU countries committing to the Paris Climate Agreement. This enthusiasm for a green future shouldn't be surprising, as Europe is currently warming faster than any other continent on the planet. After all those Pacific micronations nations get covered in water, Europe is next on the climate chopping block. While the world is still sitting below the 1.5 degree rise from pre-industrial levels, many experts predict that at current rates, we'll reach this milestone by the end of the decade. Breaking 1.5 degrees is basically like missing the good ending in a Telltale game. But breaking 2 degrees is where we start seeing severe, irreversible changes. Extreme weather events are much more frequent and intense. Food security becomes a serious problem. Almost all coral reefs die. And mass migration reaches levels not seen in all of human history. If all nations on the planet are able to hit their current climate goals, the Earth is still on track to hit 2.3 to 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. If this happens, this year's European heatwave will go from being a freak weather event to an unfortunate yearly tradition. The nation of Japan is establishing a centralized intelligence agency for the first time since World War II. The move comes in an effort to counter espionage threats from Russia, North Korea, and predominantly China. The announcement breaks 81 years of intelligence law inactivity, and follows legislation passed within Japan's upper house in May last year. The previous intelligence agency structure was Japan's Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office, or CIRO. This will now be consolidated into a National Intelligence Bureau. Since CIRO was established in 1952, the office has long struggled with maintaining effectiveness, primarily because it was never given legal authority to force cooperation between government departments. In large part, this was by design, as Japan's previous intelligence agency before and during World War II earned a pretty nasty reputation. The Special Higher Police, or TOCO, was charged with suppressing dangerous thoughts, and it was primarily concerned with cracking down on anarchists, communists, and socialists. However, over time, groups of concern would also include the ultra-right, religious groups, student activists, liberals, and pacifists. Considering Japan has one of the oldest populations on Earth, it's not surprising that it's taken over 80 years to once again get serious about intelligence. Following World War II, the Special Higher Police would be disbanded by the Allies, and as the nation would slowly transition from warmongering maniacs to anime-loving pacifists, it would become dependent on the United States for foreign intelligence. However, a consequence of this dependence was that Japan never wrote any anti-espionage laws for themselves, paving the way for foreign intelligence agents to operate freely within the country. During the Cold War, Japan was seen as an up-and-coming superpower, with some predicting that it would even surpass the United States. As you might imagine, a rising world power with very little in the way of intelligence made it a paradise for foreign spies. As Sanshiro Hosaka, researcher at the Estonia-based International Center for Defense and Security, would explain, quote, "During the Cold War, Soviet intelligence targeted Japanese technologies, industrial and commercial information, as well as US bases in Japan. As a major US ally in Asia and as an advanced technological economy, Japan remains an important intelligence target for China, Russia, North Korea, and others. To this day, Japan has remained something of an intelligence weak link when it comes to Western-aligned countries. For example, Ukraine estimates that 90% of all drones and missiles used by the Russian military contain Japanese components. Japan is like a prime Michael Jordan in developing tech, but a coughing baby with polio when it comes to it not getting stolen. The New York Times reports that Japan has recently been advised by intelligence figures in the United States, Germany, and Australia who've covered advice on technology, staffing, and intelligence sharing. Professor Ken Tokani, intelligence historian at Nihon University, believes that Japan's intelligence reform is influenced in large part by President Trump's foreign policy. President Trump has long pushed for US allies to become more self-reliant when it comes to national security, and recent rhetoric around annexing Canada and Greenland have left many to no longer consider America a reliable ally. Japan's intelligence revival follows a wider push to shore up Japan's overall defense capabilities, with Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi spending serious political capital to rapidly expand Japan's military. In May this year, Prime Minister Takaichi's aggressive policymaking sparked the nation's largest largest anti-war protest in decades, with concerned citizens fearing for the gradual unveiling of a modern police state. Despite this concern, experts state that the legislation itself does not create any significant intelligence collection or counterintelligence powers. The Japanese government has also assured citizens that these new intelligence agencies won't be used for political advantage, nor in the gathering of personal and private information. Amendments to the intelligence legislation specify that the government should not gather information in a way that undermines political neutrality, and that personal and private information are not unnecessarily infringed. With all of this in mind, an opinion poll run by the GG Press in April showed that only 19% were opposed to intelligence reform within the country, with about 42% remaining indifferent and the remaining 39% being in favor of the intelligence expansion. Similar policy reforms are likely to occur worldwide as smaller nations navigate an evolving power dynamic between global powers. China seems to be ready to reach its power spike after 5,000 years. America can't figure out if it wants to be isolationist or expansionist, and Russia is having a midlife crisis and making it everyone else's problem. Meanwhile, India's insane growth is quickly shaping the country into a 21st century contender, while the EU's military surge makes it a prime candidate for superpower status. Who's to say how the balance of power will twist and turn over the next couple of decades? The big tech push to build data centers has become this century's space race. And while many of the competitors lament the limitations of Earth, with its dirty ground and annoying rules, many within the tech industry have started asking a simple question. Why not build data centers in space? To answer this question, it's important to understand why AI companies need data centers in the first place. At its core, a data center is just a big room with a bunch of drives to store data. As AI models increase in power and complexity, so too does the data required to make them work. Globally, AI data center storage capacity is expected to reach 21 zottabytes by the end of the year, with 1 zottabyte being equivalent to 1 trillion gigabytes. This means that AI data centers alone will hold 21 trillion gigabytes of storage, enough space to hold 467 billion copies of 2016's critically acclaimed shooter Titanfall 2. As for why AI models need such preposterous amounts of data, that comes down to how AI actually learns. AI doesn't learn like a person does, but rather recognizes patterns in data. A person would see 2 plus 2 and remember from math class that it equals 4. An AI, however, would search through its memory to find that the number 4 most commonly comes next. If in all of its memory, for some reason, there was a bunch of entries that said 2 plus 2 equals 5, then the AI would respond 5 instead, because that's the pattern it recognizes. To prevent situations like this, companies will train AI on vast quantities of data to maximize the number of patterns it can see, therefore making it smarter. As all these AI models need storage, and because every tech company seems to be developing their own, data centers are being built faster than blockbusters in the 90s. But being a data center isn't exactly easy, as not only do they require an ungodly amount of storage drives, but they also need large amounts of power, physical space, and the ability to keep it all cool. On top of this, data centers have become incredibly unpopular in urban areas. People who live near data centers often report issues such as more expensive power, water shortages, and consistent noise pollution. A recent Gallup poll found that more Americans would rather live next to a nuclear power plant than a data center. Much of this anger has been leveled at so-called hyperscale data centers, defined by their power consumption being more than 100 megawatts of power, enough to supply an estimated 72,000 homes, or 500,000 gaming PCs running 2016's critically acclaimed shooter Titanfall 2. With this in mind, data center legislation drastically differs region to region. For example, Australia just announced legislation which would require data centers to produce their own electricity, minimize water use, and pay for additional infrastructure if necessary. This marked the first good piece of tech legislation in the nation's history. This is where tech companies start looking for other solutions. As crazy as it might sound, nothing about what a data center does inherently prevents it from being done in orbit around the Earth. The upsides are obvious. With a data center in space, there's no concern over draining power from communities, and noise concerns would be all but eliminated. Additionally, land that would otherwise be occupied by data centers could instead support other economic activity. be developed for housing, or be preserved as open space. The downsides are, as ever, a little more complicated. First and foremost, launching data center satellites will require rockets. Even with the reusable rocket revolution, launching payloads into space remains very expensive. Currently, launch prices sit at around $2,700 per kilogram aboard the modern workhorse Falcon 9 rocket, with a target feasible point of $500 per kilogram. SpaceX, however, is planning to achieve a launch price of $200 per kilogram using the in-development Starship rocket by the end of the decade. However, even with this significant cost cut, a few other challenges remain. Firstly, data centers operate close to their maximum capacity for most of the time, placing significant strain on the hardware. With no way to currently service the satellites in orbit, a malfunctioning or worn-out satellite will have to be deorbited and destroyed. Next, ironically, space in space is surprisingly limited. In the prime orbits near Earth, spots to sit a satellite in are in high demand. And while moving to a higher orbit eliminates space competition, it's also vastly more expensive. Just like men would rather get a 99 skill cape in RuneScape than go to therapy, tech giants would rather put a data center in space than face very reasonable legislation. Space-based AI data centers are a few years away from being an economic reality. But once launch costs come down, viewers should expect a sudden explosion of demand for launch services. On the 20th of July, thousands of protesters gathered in India's capital of New Delhi to demand the resignation of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan. The protesters represent the Cockroach movement, a political force made up mostly of Gen Z activists, who up until recently had very little in the way of youth representation. The Cockroach movement was born out of a comment made by Indian Supreme Justice Surya Kant, who, while reprimanding a lawyer for unprofessional conduct, stated, quote, "There are already parasites of society who attack the system, and you want to join hands with them. There are youngsters like cockroaches. They don't get any employment, and they don't have any place in a profession." Although later clarifying that he was specifically criticizing individuals who obtained fake degrees, the Cockroach label had struck a nerve with many of India's youth. Along comes a guy called Abhijit Dipki, who thought it would be funny to launch the Cockroach Janata Party, CJP, a parody of Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP. Within 5 days, the movement's Instagram account amassed over 10 million followers, surpassing BJP's official account. Meanwhile, its official Twitter account was taken down by the Indian government, with one source citing that it was for promoting inflammatory content. The Indian government has made a habit of taking down critical social media accounts, and Elon Musk's Twitter has had a long history of folding to requests of government censorship. The blocking was later brought before Delhi's High Court, where it was ultimately overturned. Although the Cockroach movement was built on memes and shitposts, the few issues they covered had immense appeal to their younger demographic. Along with addressing job shortages, the party would criticize recent high-profile controversies within Indian education. One such fuck-up was the recent transition to on-screen marking for Year 12 board exams. In previous years, Year 12 exams would be taken on paper, before being packaged and sent off to be graded. This year, however, exams are scanned and uploaded digitally, which is designed to allow graders to evaluate them quicker, with automated tallying of marks. However, the system received heavy backlash when some papers were found to be blurred, had missing pages, mismatched answer sheets, and entirely unmarked answers. The overall pass percentage also saw a noticeable drop from 88.39% to 85.2%. Perhaps the most damning controversy was the tragically named National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test, held on the 3rd of May. The test is a nationwide entrance exam for all undergraduate medical programs in the country, and at 2.27 million applicants, it's the biggest in the country. However, following investigations that revealed significant overlaps between the pre-circulated guest paper and the exam's actual content, the exam was cancelled on the 12th of May. Although arrests were made and students weren't charged extra to resit the exams, many saw the cancellation as an exceptional failure of India's education system. From the 3-hour and 180-question exam, only 1 in 20 students landed a spot in medical school. And exams only take place once a year, The exam is so stressful that following the cancellation, 12 students went on to kill themselves. By the time of the Supreme Court Cockroach comment, Indian students were left with a dodgy automated grading system, high youth unemployment, a seemingly incompetent education department, and 12 linked suicides. Membership criteria for the Cockroach Party is purposely satirical, requiring those joining to be unemployed, lazy, chronically online, and have the ability to rant professionally. July's Delhi protest was met with pushback from local authorities, with police stating that they had not been authorized to operate around Parliament. Amnesty International would criticize Indian authorities for suspending metro services and restricting mobile internet during the protest, which they say infringed on their right to peaceful assembly. Confrontations between police and protesters would also turn violent in some cases, and although police denied the use of force, they seemingly forgot that 35 million people in Delhi had access to smartphones. The clashes resulted in an estimated 180 hospital visits for mostly minor injuries, as well as the arrest of 70 protesters. Founder of the party, Abhijit Dipki, stated later in a press conference that another protest wasn't being planned, as he didn't want anyone else to get hurt. Despite this, the Cockroach movement has unexpectedly become the biggest public challenge to Prime Minister Modi during his third term in office. With India's median age being 29 years old, a motivated youth vote could dramatically swing the nation's next election in 2029. In more fun news, the month of July saw the Australian state of Tasmania visited by an unlikely visitor, a 1-ton elephant seal named Neil. Neil the seal has become something of a local celebrity in the coastal towns of southeast Tasmania, and has gained something of a reputation for his boisterous, chaotic behaviour. Neil has often been found playing with traffic cones, breaking fences, and making unscheduled visits to people's homes. Most elephant seals near Tasmania are born on the uninhabited Macquarie Island, 1,500 kilometres south of Australia. Neil, on the other hand, was born in Salem Bay, a relatively short distance from the state capital of Hobart. As elephant seals instinctively return to the place of their birth, Neil has continued to return to Hobart's coastal region twice a year ever since. Although Neil's antics of smashing road signs and wrecking cars is seen as strange by many onlookers, wildlife experts state that he's just doing what seals do in a more urban environment. The now 5-year-old Neil has also gained something of a loner reputation, as the isolation from his own kind makes him unable to play fight and spar with other adolescent seals. As a result, Neil has had to make do with wrestling whatever objects happen to be around his Tasmanian stomping ground. Neil's destruction has become so famous within the region that he even inspired a local insurance ad, which promised to cover any damages inflicted by seal-related mishaps. Although there's a possibility for Neil to find the elephant seal colony on Macquarie Island, tracking data suggests that he's never ventured that far south. Most likely, this means Neil will spend the rest of his life as an on and off resident of Tasmania, potentially never finding a mate. Although Neil isn't considered aggressive, his sheer size has become cause for concern among local authorities, as even small movements from such a large animal could cause serious injury to a human. Elephant seals can grow up to 5 meters long and weigh 4,000 kilos, which for any Americans watching is roughly the length of a Ford F-150 while being twice the weight. In 2022, the Norwegian government shot a walrus named Freya over public safety concerns, a decision which received criticism from animal rights organizations. To prevent a similar situation, Tasmanian authorities have urged visitors to maintain a 20-meter distance from Neil the seal. And during a recent stay, traffic wardens were assigned to follow him around 24/7 to maintain his safety. Neil is now believed to have gone back out to sea, meaning his fans will need until the end of the year to see him once again blocking traffic and yelling at local servo workers. Viewers who want to support this series can sign up to our Patreon below. But until next time, have a fucking good one.
I know that Bussy be so talented, it's doing cartwheels, but I don't care. Sign up to NordVPN and use the code AMONGUS to beat the totally sus Chungus. Attention, all sussy gamers. Tuesday is dropping a dutty track. Birthday wishes come from your friends Nick and Kerr. I also just finished an anime binge with my G, Joseph Lenton. Ara, ara, you're in a coma and the street has been overrun by ISIS. Only you can stop this. So wake up and get your bacon ready. Happy birthday, Hugh Janus, and I'm to congratulate you on your excellent work on your KD ratio in Verdansk. James Marson, what did you do with Big Chungus? We know you're the sus imposter, and I saw you vent in electrical. It's a bit early in the day, so all I've got actually is coffee, but I hope you enjoy a few pints with the lads tonight. Up the Ra.
Up the Ra, Nigel. I mean, I know that you said sorry. I know you get 87 quid. It's entirely within your rights to do that.